I'd like to thank Ihor and Carol for having me here. This is a wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts on art and expressionism, and it's also a kind of a return to home base in a way. I taught here, if I remember correctly, between 1987 and 1989, when the place looked quite a bit different than it does now. So it's been kind of fun because there are things that are familiar and there are things that aren't. And of course, it's one of the best university collections in North America, in my opinion. So it's been a complete and utter delight. I started my contribution to the Living, Building, Thinking exhibition catalog with a true anecdote. My wife said to me one day, "It's gloomy." She was peeking between the blinds at a singularly dull day in the interior of British Columbia. However, she did not just say a meteorological fact, it's gloomy. She said something in that statement that conveyed a sense of profound dissatisfaction. How? How, I wondered. Well, she said it's gloomy. She emphasized the first syllable of the adjective and dragged out the word in a way that the meaning of her statement extended beyond it's dark. Her tone of voice said much more. It implied, it's dark enough to cause me distress, with two words. No, actually, she said even more than that. She said, I am so sick of this, without actually uttering those words at all. She did not use identifiable segments of language to express an idea. She used what are called supra-segmental elements, the tone of voice, inflection, gesture, that somehow embodied the message rather than naming an emotional state. How do we understand such utterances? Well, it's like I would guarantee that you've probably heard of something called bilateral hemispheric processing, or lateralization of brain function, or as you see here, hemispheric differentiation. You've all heard this, haven't you? Well, the classic interpretation of this, at least in the popular idea, is that the right side of the brain is creativity, believing, spirituality, emotional expression, etc. And the left side of the brain excels at language, logic, lists, linearity. I find the alliteration useful so that I can remember which is which. So language, linear, logical, all start with L, left side of the brain. The other ones, by default, are the right side of the brain. I just find that easy to remember. Now, the brain actually does have a kind of a bridge between the two hemispheres called the Corpus Callosum. Sort of fun to say, Corpus Callosum. It's a bit like eating oysters or something. It connects the two halves of the brain, which have traditionally been seen as having these separate, quite distinct functions, what neuroscientists call domain specificity. So domain 1 is the language, the linear, and domain 2 is the creativity, the spirituality, that sort of business. In line with this, researchers from Carnegie Mellon University recently hypothesized that the recognition of printed words had to be handled by autonomous units in the brain with different functions. So they imagine a little module there and a little module there, and module 1 has a different purpose than module 2. So to study this, they decided to concentrate on faces. This is a reenactment of what they were doing. I actually kind of find it funny. This young lady is pointing at a photograph of a guy who's obviously agape at something or other. And they reasoned, if these neural mechanisms are actually autonomous, then you could make the following prediction. Damage to the right image handling part of the brain would impair image recognition but leave the left functions of the brain, the language stuff, untouched. And similarly, if you damage the left part of the brain, presumably the image recognition functions of the other side would be untouched. So they conducted a series of experiments with people who actually had various kinds of brain damage, particularly alexia, which is an inability to actually recognize letters and read words. Okay? There are other parts of it. That's the one I'm focusing on. Or people who have a phenomenon called prosopagnosia, which is an inability to recognize faces, even the faces of very famous people. I thought these were nice illustrations for that point. So they argue then, if you had alexia, you probably could still recognize faces. If you couldn't recognize faces, you could probably still read. And then they studied that. Well, curiously enough, they discovered that this was not the case. Their prediction turned out to be wrong. They discovered that brain damaged patients who had either of these things actually had deficits in the other field. So it was somehow generalized, though often not quite so intense, but still measurable. So they said prosopagnosics have mild but reliable word recognition deficits, and pure alexics have mild but reliable face recognition deficits. What this implies is that the two hemispheres of the brain actually collaborate in the recognition of signifiers and the production of sense, of meaning, as it were. The neural processes for both images and words are the result of what they called an optimization procedure, which rewires the organization of the brain over time. In layman's terms, this means that processing starts out in both hemispheres of the brain in young people, but over time, those functions become asymmetrically organized. That is, they're assigned differently to the two hemispheres of the brain as a consequence of a natural tendency of the brain to improve its efficiency over time. So younger people, kind of generalized; older people, domain specificity. Now, the relevance of all this might be totally escaping you. Is it escaping you? Okay, well, I'm going to make this clear to the best of my ability. So let's try it. You're in a crowded, noisy room. Okay. If you kind of make an effort, you can pick up little signifiers, little words here and there. You're not really following any one conversation, but you're hearing these little snippets of stuff. Cocktail, doctor, canapé, long-time workout, ambassador, bits and pieces of stuff. All right? One of the words that flits by at one point is the word fire. I'm going to try to visualize this in the way it might work. There's all this hubbub, and then all of a sudden you just kind of hear somebody say something about the word fire. Let me show you where it is. And it kind of pops out for you. It's pronounced neutrally, so you kind of idly wonder if the person is speaking about a camping trip, a fervent emotion, a case of heartburn, or something else. At that moment, the word, the lexical unit we call it, is ambiguous, because you don't know which one of these things is meant. It's like the list of possible meanings that appear in a dictionary. Phenomenon of combustion, one of the four elements of the alchemists. Fuel in a state of combustion, a smell gas. I don't think I like that image. A small gas, a destructive burning, anyway, da-da-da-da. None of those meanings in a dictionary is thrust into the foreground in a way that tells you what was the intention of that speaker at that particular moment. Later on, you hear the same word, but it sounds and looks like this. Fire! The word, the main signifier, fire, is the same lexical unit, but now it has a particular context that shoves some of those varied dictionary possibilities into the background. It says this one, no, back there. And the reason it does that is because it's been disambiguated. It is no longer ambiguous. And its signified is, get out now! Right? And you actually understand that in the context of a crowded room because it's evolutionarily responsible. It actually increases the likelihood that you're going to survive and reproduce. Are you still with me? Okay. Now, what's actually changed there? Well, fire was this big a minute ago. Now it's this big. So what's changed is the physical manner of the delivery of the lexical unit. So fire is fire. It's like this. But it's also fire! Okay? So what has changed is not the lexical unit itself, but the package in which it is delivered. All right. Now, a similar delivery to this, in a different context, will have yet another meaning, but you can figure it out real quick. Fire! You better get out of the way. The point of this illustration is that we use both sides of our brains when we understand the meaning of an utterance, because its performance, that is, its sound, or the visuals that I've been using here to illustrate it, differ from the normal in a particular context. If somebody shouts out a common word, it takes on a different meaning. But depending upon the context, it can be equally true that the meaning of a word is different if it is simply whispered, said rather dryly, pronounced with a notable upswing, or a downswing in pitch, etc. The left brain assigns meaning because the right brain processes the manner in which the utterance is delivered. That action isolates a subset of the word's orbiting host of meanings, rendering it unambiguous, according to the situation. In the case of fire, it is natural to quickly figure out what is meant for one's own safety. And if you don't, you're in trouble. Now, think about this for a second. In the case of poetry, we actually want the word to remain ambiguous, but the level and the type of the ambiguity varies. I'm going to try to illustrate that by quoting from this writer I came across recently. Maybe you've heard of him. It's something like William Shakespeare. And he wrote this passage I like. "These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die, like fire and powder, which, as they kiss, consume." Now that's fairly dry. The word fire here, we take at face value. It means literally fire. And when you touch fire to gunpowder, it explodes, it consumes. It's a slightly different situation when later in Romeo and Juliet, from which this passage is taken, we find this one. "Love is a smoke raised with the fume of sighs, being purged, a fire sparkling in lover's eyes." What this says, if we imagine an artist, a performer, sort of punching that word fire a little bit in the second instance, is that we're not imagining a literal flame at all. What are we imagining? Yearning, right? And I tried to illustrate that visually because my ultimate point is that you can do this kind of thing with visuals by saying, yeah, the fire we're supposed to think about here is the heat of that young relationship, which of course will flame out over time. In such ways do poets pre-select certain meanings and foreground them for us to consider. Indeed, poetry shows us that we do not hold all of a word's connotations in context at once, in consciousness rather, at once, unless we are linguists or students of lexicography. To do so on a regular basis would require a very special kind of unnatural effort. I believe that there is a parallel to be drawn between expressionistic art and the figurative uses of language that depend upon analogous performance practices instead of lexical content. The analogy turns on the idea, increasingly widespread in contemporary arts criticism, that an image does not really depict things, it means things. A picture is not a window through which we see something that would otherwise exist without the artist's intervention. A picture is a statement, a cluster of signifiers, things that mean, gathered together to produce signifieds, things that are meant. This image, for example, is a morality play in which a small child at the right momentarily distracts us from what's really at stake. The mother's rage at her disgraced daughter's load of broken eggs, which serve as metaphors of her lost virginity. What? The standard way in which many artists try to get across these kinds of readily interpretable themes is a kind of a genre of image types called, in this instance, vanitas themes, vanity. Here's another example. I particularly like this one because it gives me the opportunity to say that a Canadian painting is better than a more famous painting. See if you agree with me. A child blowing bubbles. This is certainly a cute image, but you may not be aware that it actually carries a fairly tragic symbolism. A child is like a bubble. It's charming, it's beautiful, but disturbingly, it's fragile and transitory. Paralinguistics enters the equation when you consider something that's sort of more flatly presented, like this one. It's as if this one is stated in a neutral tone of voice. Children are like bubbles in that they are ephemeral. This gives us the opportunity to point out that the painting on the left is, in my opinion, actually better than the more famous and valuable one on the right, because it actually goes farther in conveying that message. The painting surface itself conveys the transitoriness of this in its more impressionistic handling. And perhaps more obviously, the child is himself round, like a bubble. All of this says to me Children are ephemeral. Children are bubbles. That makes it a better work of art. For those of you who are interested in such things, that's one is by Paul Peel, a painter from London, Ontario. Neither of these paintings is expressionist, so get to the point, would you, Dr. Bob? Gosh. All right, I'll stop digressing now. Sometimes artists choose to depart forcibly from optical truth to draw out meaning, not because they suffer from some technical inability. This is a decision driven by a need to express something greater, something usually related to one's personal context than the sum of the parts. This is called paralanguage. Paralanguage is something that is parallel to the linguistic study of language because it doesn't involve lexical units. It involves kinesics, the gestures that one is making, the tone and the character of voice, which is the one that I found easy to illustrate quickly, proxemics, which means you are taking notes, means something quite different from you are taking notes, right? I apologize for using you as my case. Clothing, makeup, etc., neither of which I wear. Wait a minute, that's not right. So, what is this? It means, in the instance that I'm using, is that my tone of voice is intended to convey different meanings, selected meanings, rather than linguistic elements selecting meanings. So no statements actually entirely lack paralinguistic properties, because when you say something really flatly, I have a bus ticket, that still is a tone of voice, right? But it's taken to be neutral. Some statements, however, seem to carry no particular charge, fire versus fire. So further to this, the meaning of fire, specifically when screamed, differs upon context. So how can we take this idea and run with it and see what it does to help us to understand expressionistic art? Just a little reminder here, paralanguage includes facial expressions, tones of voice, gestures, eye contact, spatial arrangements, patterns of touch, expressive movements, silence, etc., etc., etc. So it isn't just screaming like a fool. The idea here is to consider the seeming excesses of expressionistic imagery, in some instances perhaps deliberately crude drawing, in others weird distortions, and still others strident colors, as paralinguistic performances intended to push meaning into areas that are notoriously difficult to put into words, whatever that really means, and equally difficult to depict directly. Consider Kata Kollwitz' self-portrait of 1924. The artist looks to our left, her hand awkwardly interposed between us and the side of her head. It doesn't show us what Kollwitz looked like so much as it shows us what Kollwitz felt like, or so we construe. The image says paralinguistically, I suffer. Why she suffered is a matter of context. This is where art history comes in. The artist lost her son in World War I and became a strident anti-war activist. This image says paralinguistically, I suffer. It says paralinguistically in context, I suffer as you will all suffer if we don't stop this madness. The image exceeds the boundaries of the personal by inviting us to share the meaning via a kind of interpersonal resonance, a sort of a aesthetic osmosis. Edvard Munch's The Kiss, sometime between 1897 and 1902, works in a similar manner. Two lovers embrace in such a way as they seemingly become one entity, rising against an indeterminate background. They make one profile, but it isn't absolutely clear whose profile it is. Is the man the dominant one? Is the woman absorbing him? This image says, paralinguistically, love leads to a loss of individuality. But there's more. Munch's mother and favorite sister died of tuberculosis, and another sister was diagnosed as mentally ill. His father was a religious obsessive. We got problems. This image says, paralinguistically in context, love, illness, and death are inextricably entwined. When we study the image, we take time to meditate on this terrible truth and accommodate it in some way in our belief structures, if we give it the time. Both images evoke emotional rather than reasoned responses, which emphasizes that paralanguage is largely a study of the expression of mood. In fact, the most common example of paralanguage is an emotional tone of voice, whether in pitch or intonation. These suprasegmental features usually affect our ability to resolve ambiguity. Let's play a game. The word die, D-Y-E, is not the same as the word D-I-E, but they sound alike. Nonetheless, one would be very unlikely to think a speaker who is saying the word die meant change the color of your clothes if they said die! the paralinguistic shift that's involved there means that the sound signifies one of the core words orbiting possibilities of meaning and not another. The Kollwitz and Munch are examples, in a sense that they're similar in character, I guess, in this regard. Their stylizations serve to disambiguate their meanings, both of which are personal and both of which relate to death. And this is actually why I called this talk, I refer to melancholy, because it seems to be easiest to illustrate melancholy in a way, because it is such a stridently different mood from our normal daily consciousness. This phenomenon that I'm describing even works when you look at sounds that have no standard root meanings at all. Classic examples are sighs and gasps, neither of which, as distinct from the words representing sigh and gasp, signify anything in any dictionary sense. But they nonetheless signify. A sigh is nothing more than an audible exhalation, but it can express boredom. I'm hoping I'm not hearing any sighs. Dissatisfaction, yearning, or the like. With that in mind, consider Max Beckmann's The Disappointed Ones from 1922. Like other works in his portfolio, Trip to Berlin, this image documents how life in a recently defeated post-war Germany has become claustrophobic and impersonal. Figures are crammed into spaces that are too small for them, and provocative postures are simply ignored. Instead of meaningful interactions caused by forced proximity, the figures actually seem indifferent, even unaware of each other. The image is boring. Well, not exactly boring, more a sigh of resignation. A metaphorical yawn expressing the sad fact that Berliners were so disillusioned, so filled with resentful acquiescence in this era, that they could expect distraction only infrequently and escape almost never. One gets a similar feeling from Gary Pearson's video work Soliloquy from 2006. Despite the radically different context from which it emerged, the viewer is confronted with an individual sitting alone doing nothing particularly interesting. The camera doesn't move away, so one becomes bored, which allows into one's mind a kind of acute awareness of unfathomable otherness. Where a sigh moves outwards, a gasp is an opposite movement of the air in the form of an inhalation, and it typically signifies fear, shock, surprise. We intuitively recognize a gasp because we share its physiological rather than lexical roots. Francisco Goya is known for revealing the most disturbingly inhuman actions in his famous suite of prints entitled The Disasters of War. We gasp in horror at his print The Same, in which a man swings an axe over his head to strike a cringing soldier. We recognize the ferocity of this gesture in the sharp contrast between the upraised axe and the mostly closed contour of the man struggling beneath it. Perhaps we have become too jaded to respond with quite the same force as did the first viewers of Goya's prints, because we live in an era in which horrifying imagery is routinely distributed by the media. Consider Richard Hamilton's Kent State, which confronts us with the tragic aftermath of a seemingly state-sponsored murder spree framed as if by a television screen. This horror, it says, is in your living room. It implies that we are all gasping in complicity. Now, in a way, sighs and gasps are abstract, which is to say that they express meaning in their very form rather than as vocabulary. Here's the thing. We do this all the time without thinking about it. I'm going to test you on this one. Here are two alphabets, neither of which says anything other than here is the alphabet that this language uses. But I'll be willing to bet that you can instantly tell which alphabet is happy, which is playful, and which is businesslike, which is serious. Am I right? Okay. There is an analogy to be found with abstract art. Now, abstract, my terminology, abstract means its representational significance is there, but it might be obscure, versus non-objective artworks, by which I mean what most people mean when they say abstract. That is to say, representational significance is seemingly non-existent. At first glance, such works might seem to be completely closed to interpretation using the tool that I'm suggesting, but like a sigh, they might connote something through a kind of physiological association. For example, we construe jagged forms as harsh and threatening because that's our experience of jagged forms in nature. Similarly, smooth, undulating forms seem pleasant or sensuous for the same reason. We understand unrecognizable, blurry images as being fast because we know what the effects of speed are on vision. We might even hear color through the psychological swapping of sense data known as synesthesia, which, by the way, was one of the things that the earliest theorists of Expressionism famously argued. Most famously, Wassily Kandinsky, who associated certain colors and shapes with the timbres of orchestral instruments. His notion was that music does not represent anything, but it can still provoke us. Images, he felt, should do the same. They should move us emotionally without telling a specific story. In so doing, he hoped to bring us closer to what he called the spiritual art. He could not get there in one fell swoop, however. Works like Three Riders in Red, Blue, and Black, this is 1911, had to build towards the fully spiritual, that is, the fully non-objective, in baby steps of progressive abstraction. I'm going to try to illustrate that. This image shows you halfway along that process because it's inspired by images of this guy, St. George and the Dragon. Now, I'll put that one away so you don't get confused by it. But now look at this print again. Can you see the horse? Sure you can. Without knowing about the context, you might be hard-pressed to identify such things. So it's useful to have that information. And its lack of representational immediacy, Three Riders, is a clear forerunner of the later non-objective works, the fully abstract works that Kandinsky produced some years later. How we make sense of such images is a kind of internalization of their non-lexical meaning, or more precisely what some psychologists call a meaning effect, which you might translate as simply the effect that it has on you as a viewer rather than some sort of canned meaning. A similar move towards pictorial autonomy appears in Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's Untitled, from a collection of 20 photographs, it's called, 1926. Two abstracted overlapping profiles, each seen from a different angle, create a strange creature that seems kind of like a Jivaroan Tsansa, which is a shrunken head, or a Polynesian fetish figure, more than it seems like a portrait of the artist. The work came to be in the Bauhaus era, when it was the artist's mandate to explore all the expressive possibilities that any technique affords us. Reluctant to let photographs become merely slaves to nature, Moholy-Nagy believed that photography could actually stimulate what he called new vision, a way of seeing that created new meanings instead of just being kind of copies of existing ones. One of the main categories of meaning effects in paralinguistics is something called the frequency code. For instance, the frequency of a small, thin person's voice might naturally be higher than that of a large, muscular person, giving rise to associated meanings like harmless, submissive for the former, and dangerous, threatening for the latter. Now, this offers food for thought about social profiling, to be sure, but it does seem to occur across cultures, and there is some evidence, even species. The notion of frequency code can be applied to visual images in the form of an ordinal theory of interpretation based on similarity. That's a mouthful. Ordinal theory of interpretation based on similarity. I'm talking about categories. Ordinal theory means you're creating categories and you can fit things into those categories in a variety of ways. So for instance, style. The rough angularity of woodcuts is a signifier of the woodcuts belonging to a class of works sharing a style. Here are two examples from this exhibition. The frequency code, to speak metaphorically, of Hallowed Be Thy Name by Max Pechstein on the left there, and Eric Heckel's Two Men on the Table, at the table on the right, is they both share angular forms. They have sharp contrasts of dark and light. They have a tightly confined sense of space, and I could go on, but in the interest of time I won't. The meaning effect of these works might be quite similar in spite of the storylines being very different. Pechstein and Haeckel belong to the same historical moment, roughly, which legitimizes this way of thinking, but somebody like Leonard Hutchinson does not. However, you can still talk about a certain similarity of forms, angularity, starkness, all in the service of creating a feeling of pity when confronted with the faces of poverty. This is a context radical shift here from Germany to Hamilton, Ontario, but the works have a kind of a family resemblance of sorts, which is what the linguists mean when they say frequency code. Now I'd like to just differentiate for a moment small e expressionist art and capital E expressionist art. This is an artifice. Some writers do actually observe this systematically, others do not. The historical expressionists were those involved with Der Blaue Reiter and Die Brücke in Germany, 1909 to 1915 and so on. The small e expressionists are the ones who are doing expressionistic things, but not in that specific context. So, all small e expressionist art is itself a kind of frequency code. Why? Because we're treated to expect that all deviations from representational accuracy, for example, bad drawing, are undertaken specifically in order to portray something emotional, psychological, or spiritual that is difficult or impossible to simply show directly. And that is the key difference between small e and capital E expressionism and the movement that preceded it, Impressionism, as I'll try to illustrate as follows. The latter, Impressionism, was supposed to be an outgrowth of what one writer called nature as filtered through a temperament. Artists delighted in showing the nuances of weather, temperature, light, and leisure. Impressionist art is the process of capturing how nature influences artists. But nature, it is not. It is a set of signifiers, originally of an attitude of satisfaction with the lot of the French middle class in the Third Republic, which extends from 1870 to 1940. It placed itself in opposition to other artistic tendencies held over from the first half of the 19th century, for example, the academic mainstream, which depicts idealistic scenes that could have been done in the High Renaissance, and the realist movements, in which social commentary was embedded in illustrative scenes of workmanlike precision. In this particular instance, a religious procession studiously ignores the appeals of a beggar here, so there's a social comment. Okay? And that led to the phrase social realism, which is what is usually meant when you see capital R realism as opposed to the realism of Ken Danby, currently showing at the AGH. Now, Impressionism was in effect an outgrowth of realism, but it kind of dropped this bit because it wasn't really concerned about the social comments. The social comments were basically limited to we're the leisure class and we're going to enjoy ourselves and things are just fine. Okay? In addition, they of course adopted the famous Impressionist technique, which was very sketchy, informal, quick, applying it to often very informal sort of everyday subjects, as a woman drying her feet, that the academic artists of the era originally detested. They thought that was just beneath their notice. That changes over time, but initially. Did you know that in the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874, there were cartoons in the newspaper warning pregnant women not to go to the show because they would spontaneously abort? Isn't that weird? There was a fourth group at the time called the Symbolists. They rejected both rule-bound academic idealism and reality-bound naturalism, preferring instead to create scenes of unbridled imagination, spiritual transport, and feverish dreams in a kind of emotionally fraught neo-romanticism. People like Paul Gauguin, who deliberately sought unorthodox ways to capture ideas, moods, in this case, even scent. It's called fragrant scent. 1893, as metaphors of another, less constrained world. This image shows us two women in a tropical landscape, but the manner of their handling, for example, the skirt of the one in the foreground, blurs the distinction between her and the foreground, inviting us to consider, is this an oceanic fantasy that only exists figuratively in the artist's mind? That is the key to how historical expression, with a capital E, emerges, as opposed to the small e expressionism of somebody like Goya, which in terms of the linguistic metaphor that I'm stretching out here would be called an idiolect, which means a linguistic one-off. There is no dialogue there. It's an idiolect. Okay? Seeing in symbolism the visions of artists concerned with the contents of their own psyches, those who became officially known as Expressionists took it upon themselves to forcibly eject the things they found inside themselves, things that needed to find a way out. They had to be expressed, which means to push out. Unlike inbound Impressionism, whose nature influences personalities, Expressionism is the outbound process of capturing how artists' personalities influence nature, or at least nature's appearance in an artwork. So Impressionism is kind of neutral meteorology. It's gloomy. Expressionism is the embodiment of the distress caused by the weather. It's gloomy. Expressionism shows us a person on a bridge saying, paralinguistically, see if this works, "Oh my God!" I can't take it anymore. In contrast, Impressionism says, "Isn't this an interesting bridge?" Even when it's gloomy, Impressionism prettily reports it. It's gloomy, but look at the interesting way the rain articulates the cobblestones. Da-dee-da. In contrast, Expressionism says, it's gloomy. It is gloomy. Perhaps it's no coincidence that the emphatic syllable which triggers paralinguistic recognition, the glue, is accompanied by me. It connotes, it's dark enough that I am depressed, and I am letting you know about it. Thanks for listening.